The governor of Darfur has just been assassinated. This is the day after he spoke out against the RSF.
2, 1.
Choose your poison, I got the potion, the remedy. Make you feel good like some Hennessy. I can show you what you've been missing. I replied, man, you must be kidding. Evil thoughts trying to play me like a dummy. You got the right one, you about to meet your demise.
And then in that same interview, calling Obama terrorist and every president before and after him a terrorist.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Third Eye Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us here at your favorite news and conspiracy and knowledge show. So let's get straight into it. Okay, our main story tonight, we are talking about Sudan again. Now, this is not just because it's a very important topic for me, but also because it's a very important story globally. Not just because of the scale of the atrocities and suffering happening there, but also the global implications of this conflict. So now, of course, we know how devastating this invasion of Ukraine has been globally. You know, it's been covered by the news, and all the terrible things that are happening because of it are covered constantly. And now, to be fair, there has been larger scale atrocities happening in Ukraine compared to Sudan, but now the scale of atrocities happening in Sudan is just as bad, and we have to do our best to support our melanated brothers and sisters just like we supported the people of Ukraine. Some of the reasons why I make these comparisons, like Ukraine, it's considered the breadbasket of the world. As I'll show you in this video here, UN Chief Martin Griffiths, he's talking about Russia's recent destruction of the Ukrainian dam and the implications that it has on Ukraine and the rest of the world.
What we still don't know is the real extent of the damage to Ukraine, its economy, and because the area now being flooded is the breadbasket of Ukraine. Right. And that's the breadbasket of the world.
As you heard the UN chief himself proclaim how the Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. Now, another country known as the basket of nutrition of the world is Sudan. The reason that it is this way, the reason that it is the breadbasket of the world, the nutrition basket of the world, is because of all these reasons highlighted in this next coming video.
Something peculiar is happening in Sudan. Saudi Arabia recently signed a 99-year lease on 1 million acres of arable land. Pakistan has bought a piece of real estate as well. Jordanian, Lebanese, Emirati, Qatari, and even Syrian and Yemeni companies have all acquired large patchworks of farmland. Amidst this land grabbing, many nations are experiencing a demographic surge, and with that comes an ever-growing need for agricultural resources. Sudan has nearly as much as arable land as the entire Arab world combined, which is why everyone is rushing to get as much property as possible, since the African state is best suited to emerge as the next breadbasket. It is estimated that the country is home to over 200 million acres of arable land that stretches along its southeast, which is unparalleled in the wider periphery. Freshwater supply from the White Nile and Blue Nile rivers replenishes the soil, making it ideal for year-round agriculture. To put matters into context, Sudan accounts for 45% of all the arable land in the entire Arab world. That right there is strategic value. Plus, the country has a coastline of about 500 kilometers by the Red Sea, allowing it to connect to the global markets.
So as you can see, there are so many similarities between these two conflicts and these two countries. And the world would be such a better place if they were in peace. And the video goes on to highlight some of the political issues that have prevented Sudan from becoming the breadbasket of the world.
Al-Bashir's government came to rely on oil revenues to maintain the bloated bureaucracy and the war effort in the south. In doing so, the once promising agricultural infrastructure, such as the Gezira irrigation scheme, which at the time was one of the largest irrigation projects in the world, was left to crumble as drought and civil strife rocked the country. By the turn of the millennium, Breadbasket Sudan had become a food importer. The land of plenty could barely feed its own people.
So now we talked about all the beautiful things in Sudan and in Ukraine. Now let's talk about how terrible the situation is.
The fighting on the streets of Sudan is relentless. Ceasefire after ceasefire has not held. Forces previously accused of genocide returning to a well-worn playbook. Terrorize, expel, and ethnically cleanse. The paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, are currently engaged in a fight for dominance with Sudan's army. But years before that rivalry spilled blood in Sudan's streets, they were implicated in atrocities in Darfur. Now, once again, Darfur to the west of the country is stalked by the specter of genocide. The damage wrought by these forces so extensive you can see it from satellite images. This is El Jenin, West Darfur. Hundreds killed, whole districts razed to the ground. And it's not only El Jenin that is burning. This is Andur. And this, Kudumi. On the ground, it looks like this. These scenes sadly familiar in Darfur. 20 years ago, the region descended into genocide. The same RSF leadership in place as their men killed, occupied, and raped. Now, once again, women's bodies are part of the field of war.
So you can see the situation is devastating in Darfur, but what is actually overshadowing these atrocities happening right now is that the governor of Darfur has just been assassinated. And this assassination took place one day after he spoke out against the RSF, the paramilitary group spoken about in the earlier video. He spoke out against genocide currently happening in Darfur right now. And this is a crime that the RSF military group has already been accused of in the past, as you saw in the video. There is sufficient evidence, in my opinion, to indict this group for these war crimes by the ICC. But the ICC is still investigating because of all the chaos that has been happening in Sudan. But this group is definitely in cahoots with Russia and are just some savage barbarians. And I can say that confidently because of disgusting evidence that comes out every day.
We must warn you, what you're about to see is shocking. This video, filmed at great personal risk, will show a girl believed to be just 15 years old being raped. The RSF have threatened rape survivors and denied their testimonies, so we feel it necessary to broadcast a small portion of this horrific assault. You see here a man in light-colored fatigues, matching those worn by the RSF. It's too awful to show in full, but when the phone pans, you see what he's guarding. A man wearing light-colored fatigues forcing himself onto the prone girl.
So yes, it is really a saddening and terrible situation, and they go on to explain here in the video that dozens of sexual assaults like this are reported every day, and I'm sure there are plenty more that go on unreported. They also go on to explain how they are backed by the Russian military group, the Wagner Group.
This is not an isolated incident. We received and reviewed dozens of cases where women say they were raped by RSF soldiers, identifying them by their light-colored fatigues and the insignia on their right shoulders. So, who is complicit in this pain? The RSF's key ally, the notorious Russian mercenary group Wagner, has been sustaining their fight and providing the impetus to slaughter innocent people by supplying arms.
This is a report by Ni'ma Al-Baghir, a CNN correspondent. As you can see, these are really terrible people, and people shouldn't be afraid to call them out, especially in this situation when they look extremely guilty just by this evidence right here.
To speak, and it does not seem suspect that the RSF couldn't prevent or at least apprehend them.
at the back of people's mind, of course, people remember the last images of the governor being taken in. After that, of course, they will be conflicting of what really happened. And the government, of course, the Sudanese National Army is saying that they're accusing the RSF behind the killing, RSF saying they are the outlaws. But for his community, the Masalit and other his rebel groups that he was leading, Sudanese Liberation Movement, will not be taking this very lightly, particularly also his tribe will not take this lightly. They will remember the last images, and now this is going to ignite and will make his community now coming out to defend themselves and maybe also to carry out targeted killings in the parts of the country. That's what it is going to create as it is. But
even more militias are going to spawn out of these armies, and they will all fight each other, and the civilians are the ones that are going to be a loss. So yes, I'm sure we're all familiar with some of the terrible atrocities happening in Ukraine at a larger scale and have been seeing them for a long time. But as I said, and as you saw, the scale of the atrocities happening in Sudan are just the same.
Well, what we're hearing from so many Sudanese is that the US could begin by using the correct language. Until we shared our findings with the State Department, they had been referring to these violent assaults and rapes as the actions of armed actors, even though most of the recorded testimony pointed directly to the RSF. And that has been a real cause of fear for so many Sudanese, because they believe it shows that the world doesn't have the appetite to hold the necessary actors accountable. And you saw there in our reporting that it's not just about what's happening in Sudan, it's about how this is going to impact US national interests, global interests. The war in Ukraine, Wagner continues, Russian mercenaries continue to sustain this fight, to allow them to exploit in the future further Sudan's natural resources. This is in no one's interest. And I think that only further baffles so many Sudanese as to why the US has not had a stronger position. And when I say baffles, I'm worried I'm not actually representing it accurately. So many of those we're speaking to are really heartbroken that the US and the international community has not been able, has seemed unwilling to do more to stop what's being done to them. And in the absence of that, Sudanese, like the ones who filmed that video, at huge risk, are risking their lives to save themselves and each other, Alex.
So all I want to say is let's drum up the same amount of support for the Sudanese people as we have for Ukraine, and we will fix this issue. Okay, now on to some headlines. Let's start off, it was just Juneteenth a couple of days ago, so happy Juneteenth to everybody. Happy Jubilee Day. First federal holiday in 40 years. So that is pretty awesome. Now let's get into the history of this day itself. Now, the day Juneteenth is to commemorate the Union soldiers going into Galveston, Texas to announce to the 250,000 slaves that were still enslaved there, as well as all the people, that the war has ended and slavery has been abolished. Now, the reason they had to go into Texas is because there was a mass migration of these slave owners into Texas in the Civil War and following the Civil War, just to have a little hideout from the laws, to hide and still have slaves. Juneteenth 1865 is when they went and they made this announcement, but unfortunately slavery still continued after that day, and even after that was abolished, it was followed by Jim Crow laws. So it is very important for us to learn about this day and the history, the real history of the United States of America, as highlighted in this next video here.
And part of when I think about someone like Ms. Opoli, part of what I think about is our proximity to this period of history, right? Slavery existed for 250 years in this country and has only not existed for 150. And, the way that I was taught about slavery growing up in elementary school, we were made to feel as if it was something that happened in the Jurassic Age, that it was the Flintstones, the dinosaurs, and slavery, almost as if they all happened at the same time. But the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter or the great-great-granddaughter. The daughter of an enslaved person is who opened this museum, the Smithsonian, in 2016. And so there's clearly, for so many people, there are people who are alive today who were raised by, who knew, who were in community with, who loved, people who were born into intergenerational chattel bondage. And so this history that we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't in fact that long ago at all. And part of what so many activists and grassroots public historians and organizers across this country recognize is that if we don't fully understand and account for this history that actually wasn't that long ago, that in the scope of human history was only just yesterday, then we won't fully understand how our contemporary landscape of inequality today. We won't understand how slavery shaped the political, economic, and social infrastructure of this country. And when you have a more acute understanding of how slavery shaped the infrastructure of this country, then you're able to more effectively look around you and see how the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but is it because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And I think
so the Plea that he talked about in this video is the grandmother of Juneteenth, and I think we should celebrate Juneteenth the way that she likes it celebrated.
People to think Juneteenth is just one day. There is too much educational components. We have too much to do. I even advocate that we do Juneteenth, that we celebrate freedom from the 19th of June to the 4th of July. Because we were free on the 4th of July, 1776. That would be celebrating freedom. You understand?
All right, so on to some more headlines here. The situation in Palestine is escalating, and I want to cover this because I feel like it's going to be followed by a lot of violence and some significant changes in the region. 6 people have been killed and 90 have been wounded in Camp Jenin after Israeli forces attacked the refugee camp with helicopter rockets. They also targeted and damaged 4 ambulances and threatened and detained some of the EMTs trying their best to help the civilians from the Red Crescent, breaking international humanitarian law.
6 Palestinians were killed and another 90 injured during a massive Israeli raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank Monday. The dead included a 15-year-old Palestinian boy. At least 1 Palestinian journalist was shot and injured. During the raid, which was met by fierce resistance, Israel deployed U.S.-made Apache helicopter gunships for the first time inside the West Bank in nearly 20 years. The raid came a day after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government agreed to accelerate the process for approving new settlements in the West Bank, despite criticism from the United Nations, European Union, and the United States.
Okay, on to our last headline here. We're talking about Daniel Ellsberg, once considered the most dangerous man in the world, as said by Henry Kissinger. He's responsible for putting out the Pentagon Papers that helped bring an end to the war in Vietnam. Ellsberg just passed away at the age of 92 from pancreatic cancer. So our thoughts and our prayers go out to his family. He is a very significant man, a very important man. And even to some of the last interviews that he's had, he is calling for the freedom of Julian Assange. As Ellsberg put it, he himself could have been prosecuted for what he's done. And he says when people can prosecute the journalist, just the journalist, for publishing information that was leaked from the government, the next thing is that they're gonna start prosecuting the readers. So thank you to Ellsberg, not just for all the amazing accomplishments that he had in his life for our freedom, but also calling for the freedom of Julian Assange. Yeah, so those are the headlines here, and that is our show for today. Thank you again for joining us. I hope it's been informational. Let's have a conversation about this. Let's really figure out what's going on in this crazy age of misinformation. Hit the comments, hit my messages. Thank you again for joining us, and until next time.
حفر حانوتي مخضرم قالوا علي متعجرف اصلا قالوا مهرطق ينطق جهلا وداك بهناك متكهرب زي ما تقول مبرني بمهلا قال جاييني اهلا وسهلا تتفضل تيتا بولا شقي ومجنون عامل جخنون في بنك 4 شلتر ما بثبت لما تفجر وقت